Hello everyone, today we are bringing you an explanation of the latest CKAD question bank version 1.35. Compared to previous versions, the overall focus of the exam content hasn't changed much, but there have been some adjustments in the details of certain questions. So, moving forward, we will be providing you with explanations of the latest version of the question bank to help everyone pass the exam more easily. Alright, today is our first session and we will start with the first question, which is about authorization. The first question is about authorization. Regarding the authorization issue, actually, first of all, what is the main point of this question? Mainly, let's first take a look at the basic requirements of the question. Let's look at the basic requirements of the question first. The second question mainly focuses on the content of RBAC authentication and authorization. In this question, the main points we are testing are as follows. Mainly, it's just one point. First of all, what do we need? Well, we need to Currently, in our environment, after you remotely access the corresponding host, there is a deployment that requires a specific RBAC permission. First, we need to confirm that the deployment is running in our current namespace. The required RBAC permissions. So, how exactly do we find or determine how to grant the necessary permissions? What should we do? Well, we need to check the error messages, specifically the log errors. In our current environment, for this first question, the issue is a lack of permissions, which causes some resources to fail to run properly. So what is the main approach for our first question? It's to use the logs to identify the error messages. The error messages actually tell us what permissions we need. All right, that's our problem-solving approach for the first question. In other words, we determine what we need by checking the logs. First of all, according to the requirements, we need to create a new service account in our namespace. Then check the existing rules and assign the most appropriate rule to the new service account. Finally, update our department. After that, please use this newly updated administrative account so that all of our resources can continue to run properly. This is the primary focus and the core substance of our first question. So for the very first step, let's thoroughly identify the problem, find out exactly where the issue is located. Right? We determine this through the logs. So here, the first step is, of course, to connect to our remote environment. Actually, our environments are all the same, including the ones we used before, like in our AD question bank. We set up these simulated environments ourselves. In fact, they are about 80 to 90% similar to the actual exam environment. So where is that 10% difference? Actually, it's mainly because we use fewer virtual machines. In the actual exam environment, there are actually a lot more environments set up. Basically, each question in the exam has its own independent environment, whereas during our practice, we obviously can't have that many virtual machines. So in our practice sessions, we just use 3 virtual machines and combine all the steps together in one place. That's the only difference. Everything else is exactly the same as the actual exam. The exam is exactly the same. All right, so here, our first step is to remotely connect to our environment. For each question, make sure you connect to the correct environment. Don't connect to the wrong one. If you get the host name wrong, that's a pretty serious mistake. But of course, you won't be able to connect, right? But if you just get one digit wrong and end up connecting to the wrong host, since we have more than 10 questions, there are just as many hosts. If you accidentally connect to the host for question 3 when you're working on question 1, after working on it for a while, what might you notice? You'll see all kinds of errors, right? No matter what you do, you just can't get through. Why is that? It's because you're in the wrong environment. So for the next steps, just make sure to carefully check your host name for each question. As long as you connect to the right one, you'll be fine. So the very first step is to connect to our remote host and check the logs. All right, next I'll walk you through the specific steps. Let's see how to solve the first question. All right, now we've connected to the remote environment. Next, let's get started with the specific steps. The first thing is to check the logs. Based on the information provided in the question, what we know for sure right now is the name of our namespace, right? So for this kind of namespace, you don't need to memorize it and you don't need to write it down. Don't bother remembering names and such. What you really need to remember are the key commands. As for names, we can just use the tab key to autocomplete them directly. There's no need to memorize them. If you use autocomplete, it will always be correct. But if you try to remember, you might get it wrong, right? That's possible. All right, so here, let's take a look at the specifics. When it comes to log information, everyone should pay attention, including the specific pod log and the pod name, right? You don't need to memorize these either. You just need to look it up, right? You can check here and it will tell us, right? Specifically where the problem is, exactly where the issue lies. Now let's take a look at the specific error message. For example, let's take a look. This is the first one. This is the first one. Then let's look at the second one. The first error, this is the first log. The second log starts with GC. All right, this is our second one. We can see that the overall error here Actually, even though it looks like a lot, right? In reality, it's just one main point, right? The central idea is just one thing, which is what? It's missing something. List, right? The error here with list code is that we can't view our pod, which is also due to missing similar permissions. So here, first of all, we found it, right? We've identified the missing permission, which is the granular permission. All right, now that we know the specific error, let's go ahead and take a look. Let's clear the screen here first, since there's too much information. Next, let's take a look at something. Let's check under our current namespace. For example, the role information, right? We've found a specific issue, haven't we? So next, we need to change this permission, right? To change the permission, first we see that there are a total of 3 rules, correct? There are 3 rules in total. Then here you can clearly see from the names that one of them is called something like pod list. So actually what we need here is this permission, right? We need this permission to handle it. So for this permission, what do we need to do here? Well, we need to apply it. Apply it to our specific service account. Next, we'll start creating it. The name for the creation is already provided in the question. So here, first we'll create a corresponding service account according to the requirements of the question. You can just use the abbreviation SA, which is simpler. Everyone, make sure not to get the name wrong. You have to create the name yourself. It definitely can't be auto-completed, so you just need to write it exactly as required by the question. Then here we can go ahead and directly create this item. Just create this item. So next, after we have this item, what exactly is the next step we can take? We can, well, take that entire hold list we just saw, that specific rule, and effectively bind it all together into one. Yeah, let's link them together. Next, let's first create this item, and then we'll create the rule binding to assign permissions to bind permissions. First, the namespace is the same, and then let's create the resource for our rule binding, a new resource. Here, everyone should note that if the resource name is not specified in the question, if it's not specified, you can define it yourself. Just make it up. For example, for this rule binding. Actually, the question doesn't state this directly, so we can simply define it for ourselves. And finally, we add the corresponding equals sign. The one we just created over there. The main resource name is called Swiss count equals. Here, if it can be auto-completed, let it auto-complete. If not, just manually cancel it. That's fine. Then add our rule at the end. Actually, this command is quite long, right? But you don't need to worry about making mistakes. If you type something wrong, just press enter. If there's an error, it will tell you where the problem is, right? Let's just press enter and see the result, okay? Look, it says here that the creation was successful, no problem. All right, our rule by D is also okay. So next, it means that our permissions are actually in place. Now the permissions have basically been fully set up, right? Now that that's done, who should we assign these permissions to? Right? Of course, we should assign them to the pod, but obviously we won't manage the pod directly here, so we'll just assign them to the pod's parent, which is our deployment. All right, so next, let's take a look at the specifics. Let's assign what we just created. Let's assign this newly created account to our deployment. First, after kubectl, always add n for the namespace. The namespace is always the same, always 1, so make sure to specify the namespace first. This makes it easier for us to autocomplete the rest of the command later on. Here, pay attention. As you can see, I wrote the same name twice, right? I wrote the same name twice. So what do these two names mean? First, the first one. What does it refer to? It refers to the name of the deployment. The second one is the name of the service count. The second one is the Swiss count, because in this command we are setting the Swiss count. So the last name here actually belongs to the Swiss count, while the deployment in the middle is essentially part of the parameters. All right, so this is how we replace the service count parameter in our deployment. After making the replacement, let's take a look at what comes next. To verify and ensure that the logs are functioning as normal, you should use the command kubectl n log, where n is followed by our namespace, then the word logs, and finally just add the name of our new one. This new one. Go ahead and complete it, since there are quite a few names here. Which one did we not have just now? Ah, the third one, right? The third one wasn't there before. All right, here we can see. Now What did we create? Look, right now, it's in the process of being created and deleted, right? It's in the process of being created and deleted. And now our latest one is already running, right? It's been running for 23 seconds, and the previous two that had errors have already been terminated and deleted. All right, so this is the content for our first question about authorization. This is actually our main focus. The way to analyze it is actually to determine the permissions based on the logs. These permissions are generally fixed. I did check and saw that it's list, right? Or list, but usually it's fixed, just this one. Of course, it's best if you check it just in case. If by any chance they change it and you don't check and just use pod list directly, then you might get it wrong. Well, at this point, you can't say with absolute certainty that it will never change, but in most cases, it actually doesn't change. Overall, the questions are relatively stable. Basically, they only change every few months. Yeah, the questions only change every few months, especially now that we've just updated to a new version, actually. The likelihood of the question changing isn't very high, not very high at all. So everyone can feel assured when using it, but still, keep an eye out just in case. If you have time, double check things more often. Alright, so the checking commands we provide in the questions, you must use them. It's not that, although it's true that in most cases the questions won't change, but just in case they do. If it gradually changes, the question might disappear altogether, right? Even though one question might not affect your final result still. Right? But what if it does? So everyone really needs to be careful here. Overall, when it comes to our black and white exam, it actually isn't particularly difficult, right? Although all of our questions are practical tasks, unlike many other exams that are mainly multiple choice, right? Ours are all hands-on questions, but in terms of overall difficulty, honestly, it's not especially hard. The key is that everyone must be careful and approach it attentively. All right, that's our first question for today. In the future, I'll continue to bring you explanations for other questions as well. And of course, one last reminder, after you finish each question, make sure to log out, all right? Log out, and after logging out, then connect to the next question, okay? That's our final point to note. Well, that's all for today. If you're interested in our upcoming questions, please keep following us. Of course, you can also leave comments in the discussion area. If there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask directly. If you're about to take the exam soon and need the latest version of our question bank, you can also send me a private message. All right, that's all for today. Goodbye, everyone.